When my son chose his wife's birthday over me lying in the ICU, I thought the light in my life had gone out forever. But I was wrong. That light, our family's light, was only beginning to burn. My name is Gilbert Santana. For 35 years, I served as the pastor of the New Covenant Pentecostal Church here in Springfield, Illinois. But today, I'm not here to preach. I'm here to tell you how I lost my son and what it took to finally understand him. It was after Thursday night service. The sanctuary was quiet, the kind of silence that follows after everyone has already gone home. I was still in my office organizing the hymnals when my son Gabriel walked in. He leaned against the doorframe and just stood there, looking at me in a way I hadn't seen before. Cold, detached. And then, almost in a whisper, he said, "I hate you, Dad. I only tolerate you because of your reputation in the church." For a moment, I couldn't move. My legs went weak. The words cut deeper than any wound I'd ever known. I felt my chest tighten, but I didn't let it show. I closed the hymnal slowly, my hands trembling, and I looked at my son. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't argue. I just said, "Relax, you'll never see me again." Then I turned my back, walked out of that office, and left the church. My heart was silent, but my soul was burning. That night, I didn't sleep. I kept hearing his voice again and again, the anger, the resentment. Maybe it had been there for years and I just refused to see it. By sunrise, I made a decision. I called the locksmith and changed every lock in the house. No note, no explanation, no scandal. Just peace. Or at least, that's what I told myself it would be. I had spent my whole life serving others, guiding families through their pain, praying for their children, healing their wounds through faith, but I never realized that my own home was falling apart. Before we continue, I want to take a moment to thank the Father's Advice channel for letting me share my story. And to you who are watching, please subscribe, leave a comment, tell me what city you're watching from. Every day, this channel brings new stories that might just change your perspective on life. I never made a fortune from ministry. My true wealth was seeing lives transformed by God's power, families reunited, addicts freed, young people finding their purpose. I always believed that if I just lived faithfully, everything else would fall into place. But faith can't replace love. It can't replace understanding. And I learned that far too late. I raised Gabriel under the strongest Christian principles I knew. I didn't spoil him, but I provided everything he needed. I taught him to respect the word of God, to carry himself like a pastor's son, to honor the family name before the congregation. But in my attempt to make him righteous, I forgot to make him feel loved. I demanded discipline. I expected obedience. I never struck him, not once, but my words, my expectations, the weight of my position, they were heavier than any punishment. Gabriel grew up under my shadow. Every mistake he made, every question he asked, became a reflection of me, and I made sure he knew it. I told myself I was protecting him from the world, but I was really protecting my reputation. I can admit that now. My wife, Marcia, used to tell me, "Gilbert, you preach love to everyone but your own family." I thought she was exaggerating. I thought I was doing what was right. But sometimes righteousness can be the cruelest form of pride. When Marcia passed away, Gabriel was only 17. That boy didn't just lose his mother, he lost the only person who ever softened me. I buried myself in ministry, and he buried himself in silence. We lived in the same house, but we were strangers. Every night I would come home late from visiting members of the church, praying for their broken families, while mine sat quietly at the dinner table, untouched. It's strange how a man can talk about love for years and never truly practice it. I thought I was saving souls, but I was losing my own son. And it all led to that night, the moment he finally said what had been building inside him for years. "I hate you, Dad." That sentence broke something in me. For the first time in my life, I realized that all my sermons, all my lessons, all my prayers, they meant nothing if I couldn't reach the heart of my own child. After I changed the locks, the house felt different. Quiet. Too quiet. I tried to convince myself I did the right thing, that I was giving him space, teaching him a lesson. But when I looked at the empty chair across from me at breakfast, I felt the truth. I wasn't teaching him anything. I was running away. A few days later, I stood outside the church again. The congregation greeted me with smiles, calling me Pastor Gilbert, shaking my hand like nothing had changed, but everything had. Behind that smile, behind every "God bless you," was a man who had failed at the one thing that mattered most. And yet, I kept preaching. Because what else could I do? I thought maybe if I just stayed faithful, God would fix what I broke. But faith doesn't erase consequences. That Sunday, I looked out from the pulpit, and Gabriel's seat was empty. It stayed empty for months. People asked where he was, and I said, "He's busy with work." I lied. I lied in the house of God. I lied because I was ashamed that I, a man of the Word, couldn't live it inside my own home. Every night I'd open my Bible, searching for peace, but the words looked different now. They weren't comforting anymore. They were accusing. "Fathers, do not provoke your children to anger." I had read that verse 1,000 times, but I never truly heard it until then. That was the moment I began to understand. Sometimes God doesn't punish us through storms or sickness or loss. Sometimes He punishes us by letting us see the mirror of our own mistakes, and I was looking right into mine. Still, I held on to hope. I prayed that one day Gabriel would walk back through that door and I could say the words I never said enough: "I'm sorry. I love you." But life has its own way of testing our pride, and my test was just beginning. Days turned into weeks, and weeks into months. Gabriel never called, never visited. I kept telling myself he just needed time, that someday, when the anger cooled, he'd remember that I was still his father. But time didn't heal anything. It only built more distance. Every night I'd sit in my old wooden chair by the window, the same chair I used to read Bible stories to him in when he was little. Back then, he'd curl up beside me, resting his head on my arm, his small voice asking questions about heaven and angels. Those were the only times I truly felt like a father. Now that chair was just another reminder of what I'd lost. I'd stare out at the street, half expecting to see his car pull into the driveway. It never did. People at the church started noticing something was off. My sermons lost their fire. I'd pause mid-sentence, staring at the faces in the pews but seeing only Gabriel's. I told myself to stay strong, to lead by example. But how do you preach forgiveness when you can't even forgive yourself? One Sunday morning after service, Sister Caroline approached me. She was one of our oldest members, a gentle woman who had known Gabriel since he was a boy. She looked at me with those soft, knowing eyes and said, "Pastor, sometimes the shepherd has to let the sheep wander a little before they find their way home." I smiled politely, but inside I wanted to cry. I had let my sheep wander too far, and I wasn't sure he'd ever come back. About 6 months later, I received a letter. The handwriting was unmistakable, Gabriel's. My heart raced as I tore it open. But it wasn't what I hoped for. It wasn't a letter of reconciliation or forgiveness. It was short, cold. He wrote, "Dad, I'm moving out of Springfield. Don't look for me. I need to live my own life, away from your shadow." That was it. No return address, no phone number. Just finality. I sat in my study for hours, staring at the paper, reading those same words again and again until they blurred. Somewhere deep inside, I wanted to blame him, to call it rebellion or immaturity. But I knew better. I had driven him away. For the first time, I didn't go to church that Sunday. I couldn't. I stayed home, sitting in silence, asking God where I had gone wrong. The house felt hollow, like the spirit itself had left with my son. My neighbors must have noticed the lights off, because later that evening, Deacon Thomas came by. "Pastor," he said, "are you all right?" People are worried." I nodded and forced a smile, but my voice cracked as I replied, "Even shepherds get lost sometimes, Thomas." He didn't know what to say. He just placed his hand on my shoulder and left. That night, I prayed not as a pastor, but as a broken man. "Lord," I whispered, "if you can hear me, please, let my son be safe. And if it's your will, bring him home someday." Months later, news reached me through one of Gabriel's old friends that he was living in Chicago, working as a music producer. That surprised me. As a boy, Gabriel had always been drawn to music. He'd sit at the piano in the church after services, playing soft melodies while I locked up. I used to tell him that music was his way of talking to God. Maybe he'd found a new way to do that, without me. The thought gave me some comfort. Still, I couldn't help but wonder, was he happy? Did he ever think of home? Then one evening, I was preparing my notes for a midweek service when the phone rang. It was an unfamiliar number. When I answered, I heard a woman's voice. "Is this Pastor Gilbert Santana?" she asked. "Yes, speaking," I replied cautiously. She hesitated. "My name's Clara. I'm Gabriel's fiancée." The word hit me like a stone. Fiancée? My son was engaged? I hadn't even known he was dating anyone. "I hope it's okay that I called," she continued. "I thought you should know. Gabriel doesn't talk much about his family, but I wanted to reach out before we get married." For a long moment, I couldn't speak. My throat tightened, and when I finally found my voice, it was trembling. "Thank you, Clara," I said quietly. "I'm glad you called. How is he?" She told me Gabriel was doing well, busy, successful, but still distant when it came to family matters. She said he'd become softer over the years, less angry, though the wall between us still stood. "He doesn't hate you," she said gently. "He just doesn't know how to forgive you yet." Her words pierced deeper than any sermon I'd ever heard. I wanted to ask her to put him on the phone, but I didn't. I didn't want to scare him away again. Instead, I thanked her and wished them both happiness. After we hung up, I sat in the dark, imagining his life in that big city, smiling, laughing, living. I prayed that she would love him enough for both of us. A few weeks later, a small invitation arrived in the mail. White envelope, gold trim, a wedding invitation. Gabriel and Clara. The ceremony would be in Chicago in 2 months. I read it over and over, my hands trembling. Did this mean he wanted me there, or was it Clara's doing? I didn't know, but deep down I felt that maybe, just maybe, it was a chance to make things right. I spent weeks preparing what I would say if I saw him again. I rehearsed it like a sermon. "Son, I'm proud of you. I'm sorry. I love you." But when the day finally came, my courage faltered. I stood in front of the mirror in my suit, adjusting my tie, staring at a man who had spent his life telling others how to heal their relationships, yet couldn't fix his own. The drive to Chicago was long and quiet. Every mile felt like a prayer. When I finally arrived at the chapel, I saw him, Gabriel, standing by the altar, handsome and confident, dressed in a grey suit. For a second, I thought I saw the little boy again, the one who used to fall asleep during my sermons and drool on my shoulder. But when our eyes met, his expression froze. He didn't smile. He didn't move. Clara, bless her heart, rushed over to greet me warmly, saying how glad she was that I came. I thanked her and turned to my son. "Hello, Gabriel," I said softly. His jaw tightened. "Who invited you?" The words cut through the music and chatter around us. Everyone went silent for a moment. I felt the blood drain from my face. I received an invitation," I said. He glanced at Clara, then back at me. "That was a mistake. You shouldn't be here." My throat closed. I wanted to defend myself, to tell him I came in peace, but my voice failed me. Clara stepped in quickly, whispering something to him, and he reluctantly turned away. I stood at the back of the chapel for the rest of the ceremony. Watching him say his vows, I felt both proud and heartbroken. Proud that he'd found love, heartbroken that I wasn't part of his new life. When the ceremony ended, I slipped out quietly before the reception began. No one stopped me. Outside, as I stood beneath the city lights, I whispered, "Congratulations, son," even though he couldn't hear me. The drive home felt longer than ever. That night, I prayed again, not for reconciliation, but for peace. "Lord," I said, "if this is the price of my pride, I accept it. Just let him be happy." But deep down, I still held on to hope. Maybe someday, when he was ready, he'd come knocking on my door. Maybe he'd finally understand that everything I did, even the wrong things, came from love. Years passed, seasons changed. I kept serving the church, but my body grew weaker. The congregation was aging, attendance smaller, but I stayed because it was all I had left. Every now and then, I'd hear a song on the radio that sounded like something Gabriel would write. I'd sit there in my car, eyes closed, pretending he was playing it just for me. That was enough to keep me going. Until the day everything changed again. It was a Wednesday afternoon when the phone rang. This time, the voice on the other end was trembling. "Pastor Gilbert?" It was Clara again. "Please, you need to come to Chicago. Gabriel's in the hospital." My heart stopped. "What happened?" I asked. "He collapsed during a recording session. They're saying it's serious." The phone slipped from my hand. For a moment I couldn't breathe. My mind raced back to every memory, every word I'd left unsaid. Without thinking, I grabbed my coat and car keys and drove. I didn't pack a bag. I didn't even lock the door. All I could think was, "Not yet, Lord. Please, not yet." When I arrived at the hospital, Clara met me in the hallway. Her eyes were red, her voice hoarse. "He's in the ICU," she said. "They're still running tests." I walked into the room, and there he was, my son, pale, unconscious, surrounded by machines. I wanted to fall to my knees, but instead, I stood there, frozen, looking at him the way a man looks at the miracle he doesn't deserve. I took his hand and whispered, "I'm here, son. I'm here." And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like a pastor. I just felt like a father. The smell of antiseptic filled the hospital room. The quiet hum of machines echoed like distant thunder, steady, unrelenting. I sat beside Gabriel's bed, watching his chest rise and fall beneath the tangle of tubes and wires. Every beep from the heart monitor felt like a reminder that I was too late. His face was thinner now, older, but still my son, still the boy I used to lift onto my shoulders after Sunday service. I reached for his hand. It was cold, limp, lifeless in mine, and I whispered the same words I'd been rehearsing for years. "I'm sorry, Gabriel. I should have listened. I should have been your father, not your judge." But the silence that followed was deafening. He didn't move. He didn't even flinch. Only the monitor answered me, one steady tone at a time. Clara stood quietly in the corner, her eyes swollen from crying. She told me he'd been working non-stop, late nights, no rest, too much coffee, too little sleep. "He wanted to prove himself," she said softly. "He didn't want anyone to say he succeeded because of your name." Her words cut deeper than she intended. That was exactly what I'd raised him to be: independent, disciplined, proud, and it had nearly destroyed him. The doctor came in, a kind man with tired eyes, and explained that Gabriel had suffered a heart episode caused by exhaustion and stress. "He's young," the doctor said, "but his body needs a break. The next 24 hours are critical." He looked at me, perhaps recognizing the pain in my eyes, and added, "You should talk to him. Even if he can't hear you, talk. Sometimes it helps." I nodded, though I wasn't sure I had the right to speak anymore. When night fell, Clara left to get some rest. I stayed. I couldn't move from that chair. For the first time in years, I prayed not for my congregation, not for miracles or blessings, but for one thing only: mercy. I bowed my head and whispered, "Lord, if you're still listening to me, please don't take him yet. Take me instead. I've had my time." He hasn't. My voice cracked, and tears spilled down my cheeks, falling onto his hand. I hadn't cried in decades, not when Marcia died, not when the church struggled, but that night I wept like a child. Sometime after midnight, I must have dozed off. I woke to the faint sound of movement. When I opened my eyes, Gabriel's hand twitched. I leaned forward, afraid to breathe. His eyelids fluttered, and slowly he turned his head toward me. "Dad?" The word was faint, rasped, almost uncertain. My heart leapt. "I'm here, son," I said quickly, gripping his hand tighter. "I'm here." He blinked a few times, trying to focus. "Why are you here?" It wasn't anger in his voice anymore. It was confusion, maybe even pain. "Clara called me," I said softly. "She told me what happened." He turned his gaze toward the ceiling, his voice barely a whisper. "You didn't have to come." For a long time, neither of us spoke. The machines kept beeping, steady and cold, like a metronome keeping time for our silence. Finally, I said, "I know I didn't have to, but I wanted to." He closed his eyes again, breathing slowly. "You always come when it's too late," he murmured. That sentence broke me open. I wanted to argue, to defend myself, to say it wasn't true, but it was. Every memory I had of him was a story of me arriving too late to listen, too late to understand, too late to be there when he needed me. Hours passed like minutes. I told him stories while he drifted in and out of sleep, stories about his mother, about when he was little, about how proud she'd be of him now. At one point, I started humming an old hymn he used to love, "It is well with my soul." His lips moved faintly, whispering the words along with me. That small moment of connection felt like the first sunlight after a long winter. I realized then that forgiveness doesn't always come with words. Sometimes it's just the quiet act of sharing a song you both remember. The next morning, the doctor came back with better news. Gabriel was stable, still weak, but improving. Clara returned, relief flooding her face when she saw his eyes open. I stepped back, letting her take his hand, watching from a distance like a guest in my own family. When she looked at me and mouthed, "Thank you," I almost broke down again. Later that day, Gabriel asked to speak to me alone. When Clara left the room, he turned his head slightly, his voice soft but sharp. "I used to think you didn't love me," he said. "I thought you just loved what I was supposed to represent." I didn't answer. "I couldn't," he continued. "Every time I messed up, I saw disappointment in your eyes. I tried so hard to make you proud, Dad, but it was never enough." Tears filled my eyes. "You were always enough, son," I said. "I was the one who failed. I confused being a father with being a pastor. I preached to you instead of listening to you." He looked at me for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Then he said, "You know what I wanted most when Mom died? I just wanted you to sit with me, not pray, not talk about God, just sit. Be my dad." His voice trembled. "But you never did." I nodded slowly, the weight of his words pressing down on me. "You're right," I said. "I didn't. I thought faith would be enough for both of us, but I forgot that love needs presence. Forgive me, Gabriel. Not as your pastor, as your father." He didn't reply right away, but then he whispered, "I don't know if I can forgive you yet. But I don't hate you anymore." Those 6 words felt like the first miracle I'd witnessed in years. I smiled through my tears. That's more than I deserve. Over the next week, I stayed by his side. We didn't talk much, but the silence between us felt different now, softer, less sharp. When the doctors finally discharged him, Clara insisted I stay with them in their apartment for a few days. It was small but warm, filled with framed photos and music sheets scattered everywhere. For the first time, I saw the world my son had built for himself. He showed me his studio simple equipment, a keyboard, a computer, and played me one of his tracks. It wasn't gospel. It was something else. Soulful, raw, honest. It sounded like healing. "I wrote this after Mom died," he said quietly. I called it grace. As the music filled the room, I felt something inside me shift. For years, I had tried to shape Gabriel into a man of God. But listening to his music, I realized he already was just not in the way I imagined. He didn't need a pulpit. His songs were his sermons. His art was his prayer. That night, as I prepared to leave, I stood by the door and looked at him. Gabriel, I said softly, I don't expect us to fix everything overnight, but I want you to know, if you ever need me, I'll be here. He nodded, and for the first time in decades he smiled at me. A small, hesitant smile, but real. Take care of yourself, Dad, he said. On the drive back to Springfield, I played Grace on repeat. The melody wrapped around me like forgiveness. When I reached home, I didn't go straight to bed. I walked into my church. It was empty, quiet, illuminated only by the soft glow of candles. I sat in the front pew and prayed, not for success, not for strength, but for gratitude. Thank you, Lord, I whispered, for giving me one more chance. In the weeks that followed, something changed in my sermons. My words became gentler, my tone softer. I began preaching not about sin or discipline, but about compassion. I talked about broken families, about the power of apology, about the courage it takes to say, I was wrong. People noticed. They said, I seemed renewed. Maybe I was. Maybe for the first time in my life, I truly understood what grace meant. One evening after service, I was locking up when my phone buzzed. A message from Gabriel. Just 5 words, dinner next week, my treat. I stared at the screen for a long moment, smiling through tears. Maybe this was how healing began, not in dramatic reunions or grand gestures, but in small invitations, quiet steps, and second chances. As I walked out of the church that night, the stars above Springfield seemed brighter than they had in years. And for the first time since that terrible night when my son told me he hated me, I felt peace, real peace. Not the kind I preached about, but the kind you feel when love finally finds its way home. That dinner marked the quiet beginning of something I thought was lost forever. It wasn't dramatic or overflowing with emotion. It was simple, 2 men sitting across from each other at a small Italian restaurant on a rainy Thursday night, trying to remember how to be father and son again. When I walked in, I saw Gabriel already seated by the window. He looked calm, older, with a little beard now. There was a steadiness in his eyes I hadn't seen before, not anger, not resentment, just quiet strength. When he saw me, he stood up and smiled, a small, unsure smile that said, I'm trying. I returned it with one of my own. We didn't start with apologies. We started with small talk. The weather, work, Clara. I told him I'd been cutting back on church duties, letting the younger pastors take more of the lead. He nodded, surprised. You? Let someone else preach? I laughed. Even Moses had to rest eventually. That made him chuckle, and for a moment, it felt like we'd never drifted apart. Halfway through dinner, there was a pause, the kind that carries all the words you're afraid to say. He looked down at his plate, then back at me. You know, he began, I used to hate these dinners. When I was a kid, you'd take me out after service to those fancy places where everyone knew who you were. I always felt like I had to behave perfectly because the pastor's son couldn't spill his drink or talk too loud. I smiled sadly. Yeah, I remember. I was trying to teach you respect, but I guess I forgot to teach you comfort. He nodded slowly. Yeah, you were always the pastor, even when you were supposed to be Dad. I took a deep breath. Gabriel, I said, if I could go back and do it all over again, I'd spend less time in the pulpit and more time at our dinner table. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked out the window where the rain tapped softly against the glass. You can't change the past, Dad, but you can change how you show up now. His words sank deep into me. He wasn't just forgiving me. He was teaching me. When the check came, he insisted on paying. My treat, remember? he said with a grin. As we walked outside, the rain had stopped and the streetlights reflected on the wet pavement. We stood there for a moment, not quite ready to say goodbye. "I'm glad you came," he said finally. "Me too," I replied. Then, before he turned to go, he did something I hadn't expected. He hugged me. It wasn't long, just a few seconds, but it was real. I felt the warmth of my son's forgiveness in that brief embrace. It was enough to keep my heart beating strong for the next year. From then on, we met often, sometimes for dinner, sometimes just coffee. Clara would join us, always cheerful, always making sure we didn't slip back into old habits. Slowly, the conversations deepened. We talked about his work, about music, about faith, not in the way I used to preach, but in the way two men search for meaning together. One evening, he played me a new song he'd written, called Second Chances. It was about redemption, not the religious kind, but the human kind. I listened, tears stinging my eyes, realizing that everything I'd ever wanted to say to him, he was now saying to the world through his music. Time passed quietly. My health began to waver, small things at first. Fatigue, dizziness, a persistent cough. I didn't mention it to anyone. Pride, maybe, or fear. I told myself it was just old age catching up, but deep down, I knew it was more. When I went for a checkup, the doctor frowned at the results. "Pastor Santana," he said gently, "your heart isn't doing as well as it used to. You'll need to slow down." I nodded, smiling faintly. "That's fine, doctor. I've been running all my life anyway." But when I got home, the weight of those words hit me. My time was shortening. I didn't know how much longer I'd have, but I knew one thing: I wasn't going to waste it. I called Gabriel that evening. "Son," I said, "how about a visit this weekend? I'll make my famous Sunday stew." He laughed on the other end. "You mean Mom's stew?" I chuckled. Well, I learned from the best. When he arrived, I could tell he noticed the fatigue in my movements, the way I caught my breath after walking across the room. But he didn't say anything. He just rolled up his sleeves and helped me cook, humming softly to a tune I didn't recognize. Over dinner, we talked about his plans, a new album, a small tour, dreams that were finally coming true. "Clara's pregnant," he said suddenly, almost shyly. My spoon froze mid-air. "What did you just say?" He grinned. "You're going to be a grandfather, Dad." My eyes filled instantly. "A grandfather," I whispered, laughing through tears. The Lord really does work in mysterious ways. Those months that followed were the happiest I'd had in decades. Gabriel visited often, sometimes alone, sometimes with Clara, her belly growing rounder each time. They helped me with chores, fixed things around the house, filled the rooms with laughter again. The church folks noticed the change in me. "Pastor, you're glowing," they'd say, and I'd smile, knowing it wasn't faith doing that, it was family. But joy and fear often traveled together. One cold winter night, while I was preparing my sermon, I felt a sharp pain in my chest. I grabbed the table to steady myself, my vision blurring. The next thing I remember was waking up in a hospital bed, oxygen tubes in my nose, the familiar rhythm of machines beside me. And there, at my bedside, was Gabriel. His eyes were red, his hand gripping mine tightly. "Dad," he whispered, "you scared me." I tried to speak, but my throat was dry. "Guess I just wanted to see what all the fuss was about up here," I joked weakly. He laughed, and that laughter was the best medicine I could have had. The doctors said it was mild heart failure, manageable with rest and medication, but I could see in Gabriel's face that he understood what it really meant. Time was slipping faster than we thought. For the next few weeks, he and Clara stayed with me. He set up his recording equipment in my living room, saying, "If you can't come to my studio, I'll bring the studio to you." He played music while I rested, soft melodies that filled the house like prayers. Sometimes I'd wake up and see him watching me, his expression thoughtful, gentle. One evening, I asked him, Why do you look at me like that?" He smiled. "Because I'm trying to remember you, not the pastor, but my dad." Those words stayed with me. I began writing letters to him, small notes I'd leave in his bag or on the kitchen counter, little pieces of wisdom, of memory, of love. One morning, I found one waiting for me on my nightstand. It said, "I forgive you, Dad, fully. Thank you for finding your way back to me." I held that paper against my chest and cried until my pillow was soaked. A few months later, Clara gave birth to a baby girl. When Gabriel placed her in my arms for the first time, I felt the world stop. Her tiny fingers wrapped around mine, and I whispered, "Welcome, little one. You're proof that love can outlive mistakes." Gabriel smiled through tears. "We named her Marcia," he said softly. My heart nearly burst. "After your mother," I whispered. He nodded. "I wanted her to carry the name of the woman who taught us how to love, even when we forgot how." Holding that child, I realized something profound. Forgiveness doesn't erase the past. It redeems it. It takes all the broken pieces and turns them into something new. My son and I had walked through years of silence, pain, and pride, only to arrive here in this moment of grace. As I sat, rocking baby Marcia to sleep, Gabriel leaned against the doorframe, the same way he had that night, years ago in my office. But this time, his eyes were soft. "You did good, Dad," he said. I smiled. "No, son, we did good." He was pretendant. The years that followed were quiet, gentle. My health continued to decline, but I was at peace. I watched my granddaughter grow, her laughter filling the spaces that used to echo with loneliness. Sometimes Gabriel would bring his guitar, and we'd sit on the porch together, watching the sunset, talking about life, about faith, about how God's greatest miracles often begin with our deepest regrets. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the sky gold, I looked at him and said, "Promise me something." He nodded. "Anything." I took a breath. "Don't let pride steal your peace, son. Don't make the same mistake I did. Always choose love, even when it hurts." He looked at me for a long moment, then placed his hand over mine. "I will, Dad, I promise." That night, after he and Clara left, I sat alone in the living room, the sound of baby laughter still echoing faintly in my mind. I closed my eyes and whispered a prayer, not for healing, not for more time, but for gratitude. "Thank you, Lord," I said softly, "for giving me back my family before calling me home." And as I drifted into sleep, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long, long time, complete peace. The morning after my father passed, Springfield felt strangely silent, the kind of silence that hums in your bones like the world itself is holding its breath. I sat on the porch of his house, my house now, still half expecting to hear his slow, steady footsteps from inside. The coffee he used to make every morning no longer filled the air with its warmth. The rocking chair where he spent countless evenings was empty, swaying slightly with the breeze. I remember staring at that empty chair, realizing for the first time in my life what absence truly meant. It wasn't just about losing someone. It was about everything they used to fill without you ever noticing, until they weren't there to fill it anymore. Clara came out quietly, a mug of coffee in her hands. "You okay?" she asked softly. I nodded, though I wasn't sure if I meant it. "He was ready," I said. "He told me he was." She sat beside me, holding my hand. "You gave him peace, Gabriel. You both found each other again before the end. Not many people get that chance." I looked out at the horizon, the golden morning light spreading across the lawn. "Yeah," I whispered, but I wasn't ready to let him go. The funeral was small, just close family, a few church members, and the people whose lives he had touched. Even in death, he brought people together. As I stood there, listening to the hymns he once led, I realized how much of him lived in everyone present. People came up to me afterward, telling stories how he helped pay for their rent when they lost their job, how he sat by their hospital bed when everyone else had gone, how he gave them hope when faith felt like an empty word. I listened to every story, feeling both proud and humbled. That was the man he was, a man who gave everything he had, even when it cost him pieces of himself. When the service ended, I stayed behind, long after everyone had left. The sun was beginning to set, casting a soft glow over the tombstone that now bore his name. I placed my hand on the cool marble and whispered, "You did good, Dad." My voice broke. "And I'll make sure your story doesn't end here." I didn't know what that meant at the time, but deep down, I felt an urge not just to live, but to continue what he started in my own way. Not from a pulpit, but through my music. Back at home, I went through his things. It felt intrusive at first, like stepping into a sacred space. His Bible, worn and filled with notes, old photographs, letters, dozens of them, addressed to me, dated over the years we didn't speak. I read each one slowly, tears blurring my vision. In them, he confessed his regrets, his fears, his hopes. He wrote about faith not as a duty, but as a journey. One line struck me hardest. "If you ever read this, Gabriel, know that I finally understand God doesn't live in the church walls. He lives in the space between two hearts that learn to forgive." That night, I picked up my guitar. I hadn't played in weeks, not since he went into the hospital. My fingers hesitated over the strings, but once I began, the music came naturally, as if it had been waiting all this time. I wrote a song called "The Porch Light," about a father who leaves the light on, waiting for his son to come home. It poured out of me like a confession. When I finished, Clara was standing in the doorway, tears streaming down her face. "You have to record that," she whispered. For him, the album that followed, Letters from Home, became something bigger than I expected. Every song was a piece of our story. People wrote to me from all over, saying the music helped them forgive their own fathers, their mothers, themselves. Some said they played it at funerals, others during Sunday drives with their kids. It wasn't fame that moved me, it was the feeling that somehow my father's voice was still speaking through me. Months turned into years. Marcia grew fast, curious, bright, always asking questions that sounded far too wise for her age. One evening, she crawled into my lap, holding one of Grandpa's old letters. "Daddy," she asked, "why did Grandpa write you so many letters?" I smiled softly. "Because sometimes love takes time to find the right words." She frowned, thinking it over. "Was Grandpa a good man?" I paused, looking into her eyes. "He was a man who tried, and that's what makes someone good." She seemed satisfied with that answer and nestled against my chest, humming a melody from one of my songs. Life found its rhythm again. I took care of the house, tended the garden he once planted, even kept his old Bible on the nightstand. Sometimes, late at night, I'd sit by that rocking chair, half expecting to hear him speak. And maybe it was just my mind, or maybe something more, but there were moments, quiet, still moments when I could almost hear his voice. "You did good, son." One summer afternoon, the church invited me to perform at a community event in his honor. It had been years since I'd stepped foot in that building. Walking through those doors felt surreal. The walls were the same, the scent of old wood and candle wax unchanged. But the man I had been when I last stood there, angry, resentful, lost, was gone. I was someone else now, someone shaped by forgiveness. When it was my turn to sing, I told the crowd, "My father was a pastor. I'm not, but everything I've learned about faith, I learned from his mistakes and his grace." I played "The Porch Light." As the last note faded, I looked up and saw faces shining with tears. In that moment, I felt him again, not as a ghost, but as presence, as peace. After the show, a young man approached me. He was around 20, nervous but determined. "Your song," he said, "it made me call my dad. We haven't spoken in years. I just needed to say thank you." I shook his hand, my voice catching. "No, son. Thank him." When I got home that night, I walked onto the porch, turned on the light, and sat in Dad's old chair. Marcia came out barefoot, her small hand clutching her stuffed bear. "Daddy," she said, "Mom says it's bedtime." I smiled. "In a minute, sweetheart." She climbed onto my lap, looking up at the stars. "Do you think Grandpa can see us from heaven?" I looked at her, the light reflecting in her eyes. "I think," I said softly, "he's closer than we think." She pointed up at the brightest star. "That one's him," she declared confidently. I nodded. "Yeah, that one's him." We sat there in silence for a while, the cool night air wrapping around us. And for the first time, I didn't feel like something was missing. I felt whole. Years later, when Marcia grew older, she'd sometimes find me sitting in that same spot, a gentle smile on my face. "Thinking about Grandpa again?" she'd ask. I'd nod. "Always." She'd grin and say, "He must be proud of you." I'd look up at the sky and whisper, "I hope so." But deep down, I knew the truth. Pride wasn't what mattered anymore. What mattered was that I'd learned to carry his lessons without the weight of his mistakes. I'd learned that forgiveness doesn't happen all at once. It grows quietly, like light at dawn. And though time had taken him from me, love had built a bridge strong enough to reach across it. Sometimes, when I play music, I feel that bridge under my fingers, every chord a step closer to him, every song a reminder that the story never really ended. It just changed voices. And every night, before turning in, I still leave the porch light on, just in case he ever wants to find his way back home. The years that followed seemed to drift by quietly, as though life had settled into a rhythm it had long been searching for. My music career continued, not with the fire of fame or ambition, but with the calm purpose of storytelling. Every song I wrote carried a trace of my father's lessons about faith, forgiveness, and the power of coming home. Marcia was growing up fast. At 12, she was already taller than most of her friends, with that same spark in her eyes her grandmother once had. She loved music, though not in the same way I did. She didn't chase melodies. She listened to them, really listened, the way my father used to listen to sermons. "Music," she once told me, "feels like someone talking to me without words." I smiled when she said that, realizing she understood something I'd spent years trying to learn. By then, Clara and I had moved into a smaller house closer to the edge of town, near the old oak fields, where I used to play as a kid. It was quiet, peaceful, and every evening the sky turned the same golden hue it did on the day Dad died. Sometimes I'd sit on the porch, guitar in hand, and let Marcia hum along as the sun dipped below the trees. She always asked me for one song, "The Porch Light." "Play the one about Grandpa," she'd say, and I always did. One autumn evening, after finishing the song, she turned to me and asked, "Daddy, do you ever miss him?" I smiled sadly. "Every day." She frowned, thinking, "Even though he's in heaven?" I nodded. "Missing someone doesn't mean you're sad they're gone. It means you're grateful they were here." She tilted her head. "So, missing is another way of loving?" That question hit me harder than any lyric I'd ever written. I took a deep breath and said, "Yeah, sweetheart, that's exactly what it is." When Marcia turned 16, things began to change. Teenagers, as every parent learns, come with storms of their own. She started staying out later, keeping secrets, arguing about rules. Clara said it was normal, that she was finding herself. But for me, every raised voice, every slammed door echoed the past. I could feel the ghost of my own youth, the anger, the distance, the silence between me and my father creeping back into my house. One night, after an especially heated argument about her skipping school, she shouted something that froze me in place. "You don't understand me! You just want me to be who you think I should be!" The words hung in the air like thunder. I saw my younger self in her, angry, misunderstood, pushing back against love because it felt too heavy. For a long moment, I couldn't speak. I wanted to correct her, to remind her of respect and gratitude, the way my father would have done. But then I remembered his face in that hospital room, his last words to me, "Always choose love, even when it hurts." So instead of shouting back, I sat down. "You're right," I said quietly. "Maybe I don't understand you, but I want to." She stood there, confused, her anger flickering like a candle in the wind. "You're not mad?" she asked. "No," I said softly. "I'm scared of losing what your grandpa and I had to fight years to get back." Tears filled her eyes. The fight drained out of her like air from a balloon. She sat beside me and whispered, "I'm sorry, Daddy." I wrapped my arm around her. "Don't be. We're both learning." After that night, something changed between us. We talked more, really talked. I told her stories about her grandfather, about the years I wasted being angry, about how forgiveness saved my life. She listened, quiet but attentive, her eyes full of thought. One evening, she said something that caught me off guard. "Maybe Grandpa had to make those mistakes so you could be the kind of dad you are now." I looked at her, tears welling. "Maybe you're right," I whispered. Time moved gently again. Marcia graduated high school, then college. She started teaching music at a local school, saying she wanted to help kids find their voice. Watching her step into adulthood filled me with pride and a strange kind of nostalgia. I saw in her a reflection of every generation before us, each carrying pieces of the last. When she got married, I walked her down the aisle with my father's wedding band tied inside my pocket. The church was small, just like the one where Dad preached all those years ago. As I handed her over to the man she loved, I whispered, "Remember, love isn't about being perfect. It's about staying when it's hard." She smiled through tears. "Like you and Grandpa?" I nodded. "Exactly like that." Years passed. Clara and I grew older. The house became quieter, except for the visits from Marcia and her husband, and eventually their little boy, whom they named Gilbert. The first time I heard that name spoken aloud again, I broke down. Holding that tiny baby, I felt time fold in on itself, the past, the present, the future, all resting in my arms. One evening, when Gilbert was about 5, he asked me, "Grandpa, who am I named after?" I smiled. "You're named after a man who made a lot of mistakes, but who loved even more." He frowned. "Was he a hero?" I thought for a long moment. "No," I said finally. "He was something better. He was human." As the years went on, I began writing again. Not songs, this time letters. Just like Dad used to. Letters for Marcia, for Clara, for little Gilbert. I wanted to leave words behind, not out of fear of being forgotten, but because I knew how powerful words could be when they reached the right heart at the right time. In one of those letters I wrote, "Forgiveness isn't about forgetting who hurt you. It's about choosing to see who they were before the pain. And love is the quiet decision to keep the porch light on, no matter how long it takes for someone to come home." I left that letter on Marcia's piano one afternoon before heading out for a walk. She found it later that evening and called me, her voice trembling. "Dad," she said, "you always know what to say." I chuckled. "No, sweetheart, I just had a good teacher." Life slowed, as it always does. Clara passed away one gentle spring morning, her hand in mine. She went peacefully, like a song reaching its final note. Losing her broke something in me, but it didn't destroy me. I'd learned by then that grief wasn't an ending, it was a bridge. Every memory of her became a prayer, every tear a way of keeping her close. After the funeral, Marcia and Gilbert moved in for a while to keep me company. I would sit with my grandson on the porch, watching the fireflies blink in the dusk. He'd always ask for the same story. "Tell me about the porch light again, Grandpa." And I would. Every time, as though it were the first. One night, as he drifted off to sleep in my lap, Marcia looked at me and said, "You know, he looks at you the same way you used to look at Grandpa." I smiled. "Then I guess the light's still on." That night, after everyone went to bed, I stayed outside, the soft hum of crickets filling the air. I looked up at the sky, the same sky my father must have stared at years ago, and whispered, "We did good, Dad." And though the world was quiet, I could almost hear him answer, "Yes, son, you did." In the final chapter of my life, time no longer felt like a line. It moved like a circle, everything returning, everything repeating, everything finding its place again. The house was quieter now, yet it wasn't lonely. It carried the weight of laughter, of songs, of prayers whispered over dinners and bedsides. Every creak of the floorboard, every hum of wind against the windows, felt alive with memory. I had grown slower. The walks I used to take around the block became strolls to the edge of the porch. My hands trembled more than before, but my heart, though fragile, was steady. I had made peace with so much, with my past, my father, my failures, my fears. What remained was gratitude. Marcia visited every day, often bringing little Gilbert along after school. He'd burst through the front door, shouting, "Grandpa, I'm here!" As if I might have forgotten. Every time, I'd open my arms wide and say, "Well, it's about time you showed up, young man." He'd laugh, that kind of pure laughter that shakes loose all the dust from the soul. We had our little rituals. I'd make him cocoa while he sat at the kitchen table coloring. Sometimes he'd hum without realizing it, the same melody I used to sing to him when he was a baby. Once, he asked me, "Grandpa, do you still write songs?" I smiled. "Not as much as I used to. The words don't come as easy anymore." He looked up and said, "Maybe the songs are still there, they're just inside now." I stared at him, amazed. Out of the mouths of children, truth always seems to find its way. That night, after he and Marcia left, I sat at the piano. It had been years since I'd touched the keys. Dust covered the wood, but the sound was still warm, still familiar. I played slowly, softly, not a full song, just fragments. Each note carried a memory. My father's voice, my mother's laughter, Clara's touch, Marcia's first steps, Gilbert's little hand gripping mine. I realized then that music had never left me. It had simply changed form. Now, it was the rhythm of my breath, the cadence of gratitude in my heart. As winter rolled in, my health began to fade more noticeably. The doctors said my heart was tired. I liked that word, tired. It didn't mean broken. It meant it had done its work. It had carried me through storms and reconciliations, through love and loss, and now it simply wanted to rest. I didn't fear it. Death no longer felt like an ending to me. It felt like going home to a place I'd been preparing for all my life. One afternoon, Marcia found me sitting on the porch, wrapped in a blanket, watching the grey clouds drift across the sky. "Dad," she said softly, sitting beside me, "you should be inside. It's cold." I smiled. I just wanted to see the light. She followed my gaze to the porch lamp that had stayed lit every evening since my father's passing. "Still keeping it on?" she asked, half teasing. "Always," I said. "It's a promise." She looked at me for a long moment before speaking again. "You've kept every promise you ever made." I chuckled. "Oh, I've broken a few too." She shook her head. "Not the ones that mattered." Her voice trembled slightly. "When you're gone—" I stopped her there gently. "No tears yet, Marcia. I'm still here." But she continued, her eyes glistening. "When you're gone, how will I know you're still with me?" I reached over and took her hand. "Every time you forgive someone, every time you love, even when it's hard, that'll be me. Every song you hear that makes your heart ache and heal at the same time, that'll be me. And when you turn on this porch light, remember, it's not just for me. It's for everyone who's ever needed to find their way home." She leaned into me, her head on my shoulder, and we sat in silence as the first snow began to fall. That winter was long and slow. The days blurred together in a kind of gentle peace. Sometimes I'd wake before dawn, the world still dark, and I'd talk quietly to God. Not the God I used to argue with or preach about, but the one who'd been with me all along, patient and kind. I'd say, Thank you for letting me live enough to learn how to love, and I'd mean it. As my strength waned, I spent more time in bed. Marcia and Gilbert would visit every morning. He'd sit beside me, reading his little books out loud. One day, he closed his story and asked, "Grandpa, are you going to go see Grandma soon?" I smiled faintly. "Maybe. I think she's been waiting a while." He nodded, thoughtful. "Will you tell her I said hi?" I laughed softly. "I'll make sure she knows." Then he added, "And don't forget to tell Great-Grandpa Gilbert I like his name." My eyes filled with tears. "I won't forget, buddy. Promise." "Thank you much, Spingen 616. As the weeks passed, I could feel the distance between life and whatever came next, growing thinner, softer. It wasn't frightening. It felt like the final verse of a long, beautiful song. Every night before I closed my eyes, I'd whisper, "The porch light's still on." One evening, Marcia found me writing something on a folded piece of paper. "Another letter?" she asked. I nodded. "For you and Gilbert." She hesitated. "Can I read it?" I smiled. "Not yet. You'll know when it's time." That night, after they left, I placed the letter on the table beside my bed. I looked around the room, the old photos, the guitar, the lamp casting its soft glow. My eyes rested on the small cross that hung above the door. I thought of my father then, the man I once hated, the man I learned to love again. And I whispered, "Thank you for finding me." Then, quietly, I closed my eyes. When Marcia came the next morning, the sun was spilling through the curtains, painting everything gold. She found me lying peacefully, my hands folded, the faintest smile on my face. The letter was waiting on the table. With trembling fingers, she opened it. It read, "My dearest Marcia, if you're reading this, I've finally gone home. Don't let your heart break too long. Grief is just love looking for a place to rest. Let it rest here, with me. Tell Gilbert that every sunrise is a reminder that we're never really gone. We just change rooms in the same house called love. And remember, the porch light stays on. Always. With all my love. Dad." Marcia pressed the letter to her chest and wept, not with despair, but with the kind of tears that come when something sacred ends. Later that evening, as the sky turned orange and purple, she stood on the porch with little Gilbert. Together, they switched on the light. "Why do we keep it on, Mummy?" he asked. She smiled through her tears. "So they can find their way home, sweetheart. Always." Vir. The two of them stood there, bathed in the warm glow, watching the light flicker gently against the night. In that moment, the house didn't feel empty at all. It felt full of laughter, of prayer, of music, of love that had learned how to last. And somewhere, beyond time and distance, I like to think my father and I were standing together again, two men looking down, smiling at the glow of that light that had never gone out. Because in the end, that's what our story was always about. Not perfection, not pain, but the courage to forgive, to love, to keep the light burning for as long as it takes for someone to find their way home. Years passed, quietly and steadily, the way rivers move without ever stopping. The porch light still glowed every evening, a small, steadfast star that refused to fade. For Marcia, that light became more than a memory. It was a compass. Whenever life felt too heavy, she'd stand at the window and whisper, "Dad, I could use some light tonight." And somehow, the glow seemed a little brighter. Little Gilbert grew fast, as children do. He was curious, kind, and gentle, a boy with his grandfather's eyes and the same quiet way of seeing the world. He'd often ask his mother to tell stories about Grandpa Henry. "What was he like?" he'd say, sitting cross-legged on the rug. Marcia would smile. "He was stubborn, thought he knew everything, but he had the biggest heart." Then she'd laugh softly, "And he made terrible pancakes." Gilbert would giggle. "Then I'll be just like him." In those moments, the air in the house would shift, as if the past and present had joined hands for a while. As Gilbert grew older, he started taking an interest in music. One afternoon, Marcia found him in the attic, rummaging through old boxes. "What are you doing up here?" she asked. He looked up, holding something wrapped in cloth. "I found Grandpa's guitar." The instrument was dusty but still beautiful, its wood rich and deep with age. Gilbert strummed a few strings, and the sound that filled the room felt like time folding in on itself, familiar, tender, eternal. He practiced every day after that. Not just because he loved music, but because he felt close to his grandfather when he played. And sometimes, when he played the right chord, Marcia could swear she heard another note, faint, distant, as if someone else was playing along. Life went on, as it always does. Marcia remarried a kind man named Daniel, who treated Gilbert like his own son. They built a new rhythm together: Sunday dinners, walks through the park, evenings spent reading by the fire. Yet, no matter how much time passed, the presence of her father lingered in the corners of her life, not as a ghost, but as a quiet warmth. Every Christmas, Marcia would bring out her father's old letter, still folded neatly, its edges soft with years. She'd read it out loud to Gilbert before bed. The words had become a kind of family prayer, a reminder that love doesn't end, it just changes form. When Gilbert turned 18, he was accepted into a university across the country. On the night before he left, he and Marcia stood on the porch, just like she and her father had years ago. The light flickered gently in the wind. "Mom," he said, "do you ever miss him?" She took a deep breath. "Every day. But missing him doesn't hurt like it used to. It feels like gratitude now." He nodded thoughtfully, then said, "I think I understand. I don't remember him much, but I feel like he remembers me." Marcia smiled. "Oh, he does. You carry him with you. Every time you play, every time you choose kindness over pride, that's him." He looked up at the light. "Then I'll keep it burning." That night, after he'd gone to bed, Marcia stepped out onto the porch alone. She gazed at the glowing bulb, still the same fixture her father had installed decades ago. For the first time in a long while, she whispered, "Dad, we're okay." The next morning, she woke early to see Gilbert off. The car was packed, the sun just rising, painting everything gold, the same soft gold that had filled her father's room the morning he passed. Before he drove away, Gilbert turned to her and said, "Mom, when I have my own place, I'm going to put a porch light out front. Every night. So I don't forget where I came from." Marcia's throat tightened. That's exactly what he would have wanted. As the car disappeared down the road, she stood there for a long time, her robe pulled tight against the cool air, watching until the horizon swallowed him. Then she turned back toward the house, flicked off the porch light for the day, and smiled. The world kept moving, but somehow it felt full, not with loss, but with legacy. Years later, when Gilbert had children of his own, he told them stories about a man they'd never met, a man who believed in forgiveness, who sang songs about home, who kept a light burning for those who were lost. His children listened wide-eyed, their faces lit by the same glow that had guided 3 generations. One evening, as Gilbert tucked his daughter into bed, she asked, "Daddy, do you think Great-Grandpa can see us?" He smiled, brushing her hair aside. "Oh, I think he never stopped watching. You see that light outside?" She nodded. "As long as it's shining, he's right here. He's not his." There's second. Later that night, when the house was quiet, Gilbert went to his old guitar. He strummed softly a simple tune, one his mother used to hum, the same melody his grandfather had written years before. The notes floated into the dark, blending with the hum of crickets and the soft wind through the trees. As he played, he felt something he couldn't quite explain, not sadness, not nostalgia, but connection, like the thread of time had looped back to him, wrapping him gently in everything that had come before. He whispered into the air, "The porch light's still on, Grandpa." And in that moment, it didn't matter how many years had passed or how much the world had changed. Love, that quiet, stubborn, enduring love, was still there. It always would be. The story didn't end with Henry's death. It lived on through the way his family chose to live, with kindness, with forgiveness, with light. because that's what he left behind, not possessions or wealth, but a way of being, a belief that no one is too far gone, no heart too hardened, no night too dark to find its way home again. And so, the porch light glowed not just on their house, but in every act of love passed down through their family. It became more than a symbol. It became a promise renewed with every sunrise. A promise that, no matter how far we drift, there will always be someone or something waiting to guide us back. Always. Time has a way of softening everything, the sharp edges of grief, the loudness of youth, even the weight of regret. It doesn't erase, but it transforms. And by the time Gilbert reached his 70s, he understood that better than most. He lived in a small town by the coast, in a house with a porch that faced the sea. The air always smelled like salt and sunlight, and the wind carried songs from the waves that reminded him of his grandfather's music, simple, honest, and timeless. Every evening, as the sun began to sink into the horizon, Gilbert would sit outside with his old guitar. Its wood was worn smooth from decades of use, the strings replaced countless times, but still holding the same tune. He'd play softly, letting the notes drift across the ocean breeze. Some neighbors said they could hear it faintly when the wind was just right, a melody that made them feel both sad and peaceful. Inside the house, the porch light glowed, steady and warm. It had followed him everywhere, from his childhood home to his college dorm, to every place he'd lived since. No matter how far he went, that light was the one thing he always carried with him. And when he grew too old to travel, it was the one thing he refused to let go of. Now, Gilbert had grandchildren of his own, two curious, bright-eyed kids named Lila and Henry, after his grandfather. They loved spending weekends at Papa Gil's house. They'd run barefoot on the wooden floors, chase each other through the garden, and sit at his feet while he played his guitar. "Papa," little Lila asked one evening, her head resting on his knee, "why do you always play that same song?" Gilbert smiled, his eyes glinting with that familiar, gentle warmth. "Because it's a song about home," he said. "But we're already home," Henry chimed in. Gilbert chuckled. "Home isn't just a place, buddy. It's the people you love, the memories you keep, the promises you don't forget. Even when they're gone, they're still right here." He tapped his chest lightly. "In here." The children listened, half understanding, half dreaming, as he continued to play. The light from the porch spilled across the yard, touching the edges of the garden, the fence, the path leading down toward the beach. It was the same soft gold glow that had illuminated generations before him, a thread connecting them all. Later that night, after the kids had gone to bed, Gilbert sat alone on the porch, the waves whispering in the distance. He thought of his mother, of her laugh, of the nights she'd read her father's letter by candlelight. He thought of his grandfather, Henry, the man who had taught the whole family what it meant to love without conditions. "Grandpa," he murmured into the darkness, "the light's still on, just like you wanted." For a long while, he sat in silence, feeling the sea breeze brush against his skin, listening to the hum of the night. Then, as if guided by instinct, he picked up his pen and began to write. To Lila and Henry, "Someday, when you're older, you'll understand that every family has a story that carries them through time. This is ours. It started with a man who thought he'd lost everything, but found love again through forgiveness. It's a story about second chances, about keeping the light burning even when the world goes dark. You'll hear people say that time heals all wounds, but the truth is, it's love that does that. Love is what keeps us whole, what brings us back to each other, even after we're gone. When I'm not here anymore, keep the porch light on, not for me, but for whoever might need it, a friend, a stranger, someone finding their way. Let it be your way of saying, you're not alone. Because that's what Grandpa Henry taught us all. Love isn't meant to stay locked away in memory, it's meant to shine. He folded the letter carefully and placed it inside the guitar case, the same case that had once belonged to his grandfather. Then he leaned back, closed his eyes, and listened to the sea. The next morning, the grandchildren woke to find him asleep in his chair, the guitar resting beside him, the light still glowing softly above. His face was peaceful, no fear, no pain, just calm. When the family gathered later that day, Marcia, now a grandmother herself, stood quietly on the porch, tears in her eyes but a smile on her lips. "He kept the light burning," she whispered. That evening, as the sun dipped below the ocean, Lila asked her mother, "Should we turn it off now that Papa's gone? Does wandered too big a 2000?" Her mother knelt down beside her. "No, sweetheart, we'll keep it on. It's what he would have wanted." And so they did. As night fell, the little house by the sea shone like a beacon against the dark, the same glow that had started so many years ago with one man's promise to never let love be forgotten. From the road, travelers could see it, a single warm light against the vast blue night, and though they didn't know the story behind it, they felt comforted. Some even said that when they passed by that stretch of coast, they felt less alone, as if someone was silently watching over them. The light had become more than a family ritual. It was a legacy, a quiet reminder that kindness endures, forgiveness saves, and love, once given, never dies. And somewhere beyond the horizon, in a place beyond time, 3 generations stood side by side, Henry, Marcia, and Gilbert, smiling, watching the glow of that little porch light. Not because it was bright, but because it had never gone out. Because even the smallest light, when born from love, can outlast the darkness. The sea was calm that night, a dark mirror stretching endlessly toward the horizon. The waves whispered like old friends, speaking in low tones, carrying with them the echoes of every story ever told on those shores. Above, the stars blinked faintly, patient and eternal. And there, perched on the edge of the coast, the little house with the glowing porch light stood exactly as it always had, unwavering, humble, but alive. Time had moved on, as it always does, taking faces and voices with it, leaving only the gentle traces of memory. But the porch light still burned. Its glow had watched over births and goodbyes, laughter and silence, beginnings and endings. Inside that house, Lila, now a woman grown, sat by the window, watching the light sway in the sea breeze. Her own children were asleep upstairs, the same age she'd been when her grandfather Gilbert first told her the story of the man who kept the light on. Over the years, the story had changed in small ways, words softened, details blurred, but its heart never did. That night, she felt something stir in her, a quiet pull, as if the generations before her were whispering, "It's your turn now." She rose, walked to the old shelf in the living room, and pulled down a weathered guitar case. Inside was the same letter Gilbert had written decades ago. The paper yellowed, the ink faded, but the message clear. She read it once more, tears glistening as she whispered the final line aloud. "Because that's what Grandpa Henry taught us all. Love isn't meant to stay locked away in memory. It's meant to shine." She pressed the letter to her chest, then looked toward the porch, where the light hummed softly against the dark. For a moment, she imagined them there, her great-grandfather Henry, her grandmother Marcia, her grandfather Gilbert, all standing together, smiling at her the way only family can, the way love remembers. She didn't need to hear their voices to know what they were saying. She could feel it. Keep the light on. And so she did. From that night on, Lila began her own tradition. Every evening, she'd gather her children on the porch, sit them down with mugs of cocoa, and tell them the story. The story of a man who thought he'd lost everything but found grace through forgiveness. The story of a daughter who chose love over pride. The story of a family who learned that home wasn't a place, it was a light you carried within you. Her youngest, a boy named Ben, would always ask the same question, "Mama, do you think great-great-grandpa can see us?" And she'd smile, tucking a strand of hair behind his ear. "He never stopped watching, sweetheart. As long as this light burns, they're all here. Re's in my stead not, releftig gat sladgen." Then, before bed, She'd step outside one last time, breathing in the cool ocean air, and glance at that golden glow, a quiet flame defying the dark. It wasn't just a ritual anymore. It was a legacy. Years passed, and the world changed. New technology, new faces, new struggles. But the porch light never changed. It remained what it had always been, a symbol of hope for anyone who passed by, a small beacon whispering, "You are not forgotten. You are loved. You can still come home." And people did. Travelers, lost souls, neighbors in need, they all came. Some knocked on Lila's door asking for directions, others came seeking silence. And though she never told them the whole story, she'd smile, invite them to sit for a while, offer them tea, and simply listen. Because sometimes that's all people need, a light and a listener. One autumn evening, long after her children had grown and left home, Lila stood by the porch once more, the sea roaring softly below. The air was cool, the scent of rain on the wind. She reached for the old light switch, the same one her grandfather's hands had once touched, and paused. Her voice trembled, barely a whisper. "Thank you for never leaving." The bulb flickered, just slightly, as if in response. She smiled. That night, a storm came in from the sea, wild winds, heavy rain, thunder echoing across the coast. Power flickered all through the town, lights went out one by one, but the old house stood firm. And when the storm finally passed, when the clouds broke and dawn stretched across the sky, the porch light was still there, shining through the mist. Neighbors said it was impossible, that the power grid had gone down, but those who knew the story didn't question it. They just smiled and said, "It's that family again, the ones who keep the light on." Lila lived many more peaceful years, and when her time came, her children did what she had done, and her parents before her, they kept the porch light on, not out of grief, but out of gratitude. And as the generations went on, the story spread far beyond that little town. People began lighting porch lamps, window candles, even digital beacons online, all inspired by a simple truth passed down through one family's story, that love, when shared, becomes light, and light, when kept burning, becomes home. If you had been standing there that final evening by the sea, under the soft hum of the lamp, you might have seen what some swore they did. 3 silhouettes on the edge of the porch. A man with kind eyes and a gentle smile, a woman with her hand resting on his arm, and beside them, a boy with a guitar slung across his shoulder. They weren't ghosts. They were memory, living, breathing, shimmering with the glow of everything that love had built. And as the waves carried their laughter out into the world, the porch light flickered once, twice, and then steadied again, burning brighter than ever. Because in the end, it was never just about one family, or one house, or one lamp. It was about the truth Henry had discovered all those years ago, that forgiveness is the doorway, love is the light, and home is wherever that light is still shining. The porch light stays on, always.